John Scotus Eriugena, or Johannes Scotus Eriugena, was an Irish theologian, neoplatonist philosopher and poet. He wrote a number of works, but is best known today, and had most influence in subsequent centuries, having translated and made commentaries upon the work of Pseudo-Dionysius. Name. The spelling Eriugena is perhaps the most suitable surname form, as he himself uses it in one manuscript. It means Ireland-born. Scotus's in the Middle Ages was the Latin term for Irish or Gaelic, so his name translates as John, the Irish-born Gael. The spelling Scotus's has the authority of the early manuscripts until perhaps the 11th century. Occasionally he is also named Scotus in the manuscripts. He is not to be confused with the later philosopher John Duns Scotus. Life. Johannes Scotus Eriugena was an Irishman educated in Ireland. He moved to France and took over the Palatine Academy at the invitation of Carolingian King Charles the Bull. He succeeded Alcuin of York as head of the Palace School. The reputation of this school, part of the Carolingian Renaissance, seems to have increased greatly under Eriugena's leadership, and the philosopher himself was treated with indulgence by the king. Whereas Alcuin was a schoolmaster rather than a philosopher, Eriugena was a noted Greek scholar, a skill which, though rare at the time in Western Europe, was used in the learning tradition of early and medieval Ireland, as evidenced by the use of Greek script in medieval Irish manuscripts. He remained in France for at least 30 years, and it was almost certainly during this period that he wrote his various works. The latter part of his life is unclear. There is a story that in 882 he was invited to Oxford by Alfred the Great, laboured there for many years, became abbot at Malmesbury, and was stabbed to death by his pupils with the styli. Whether this is to be taken literally or figuratively is not clear, and some scholars think it may refer to some other Johannes. He probably never left France, and the date of his death is generally given as 877. For the evidence available, it is impossible to determine whether he was a cleric or a layman. The general conditions of the time make it likely that he was a cleric and, perhaps, a monk. Works. His work is largely based upon St. Augustine, Pseudo-Dionysius, Maximus the Confessor, and the Cappadocian Fathers, and is clearly Neoplatonist. He revived the transcendentalist standpoint of Neoplatonism with its graded hierarchy approach. By going back to Plato, he revived the nominalist-realist debate. The first of the works known to have been written by Eriugena during this period was a treatise on the Eucharist, which has not survived. In it he seems to have advanced the doctrine that the Eucharist was merely symbolical or commemorative, an opinion for which Berengar of Tours was at the later date censured and condemned. As a part of his penance, Berengarius is said to have been compelled to burn publicly Eriugena's treatise. So far as we can learn, however, Eriugena was considered orthodox and a few years later was selected by Hincmar, Archbishop of Reims, to defend the doctrine of liberty of will against the extreme predestinarianism of the monk Gottschalk. Many in the Church opposed Gottschalk's position because it denied the inherent value of good works. The treatise De Divina Praedestination, composed for this occasion, has been preserved, and it was probably from its content that Eriugena's orthodoxy became suspect. Eriugena argues the question of predestination entirely on speculative grounds, and starts with the bold affirmation that philosophy and religion are fundamentally one and the same. Even more significant is his handling of authority and reason. Eriugena offered a skilled proof that there can be predestination only to the good, for all folk are summoned to be saints. The work was warmly assailed by Drepanius Florus, canon of Lyons, and Prudentius, and was condemned by two councils, that of Valence in 855, and that of Langs in 859. By the former council his arguments were described as Pultis Scotorum and Commentum Diaboli. Eriugena believed that all people and all beings, including animals, reflect attributes of God, towards whom all are capable of progressing and to which all things ultimately must return. Eriugena was a believer in apokatastasis, a universal reconciliation, which maintains that the universe will eventually be restored under God's dominion. Translation of Pseudo-Dionysius. At some point in the centuries before Eriugena, a legend had developed that Saint Denis, the first bishop of Paris and patron saint of the important abbey of Saint Denis, was the same person as both the Dionysius the Areopagite mentioned in Acts 17.34 and Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, a figure whose writings were not yet being circulated in the West in the 9th century. Accordingly, in the 820s, ambassadors from the Byzantine emperor to the court of Louis the Pious donated Louis a Greek manuscript of the Dionysian corpus, which was immediately given to the abbey of St. Denis in the care of Abbot Hilduin. Hilduin proceeded to direct a translation of the Dionysian corpus from Greek into Latin, based on this single manuscript. Soon after, probably by the middle of the 9th century, Eriugena made a second Latin translation of the Dionysian corpus, and much later wrote a commentary on the celestial hierarchy. This constitutes the first major Latin reception of the Areopagite. It is unclear why Eriugena made a new translation so soon after Hilduin's. It has often been suggested that Hilduin's translation was deficient, though this is a possibility. It was a serviceable translation. Another possibility is that Eriugena's creative energies and his inclination toward Greek theological subjects motivated him to make a new translation. Eriugena's next work was a Latin translation of Dionysius the Areopagite, undertaken at the request of Charles the Bull. This also has been preserved, and fragments of a commentary by Eriugena on Dionysius have been discovered in manuscript. A translation of the Areopagite's writings was not likely to alter the opinion already formed as to Eriugena's orthodoxy. Pope Nicholas I was offended that the work had not been submitted for approval before being given to the world, and ordered Charles to send Eriugena to Rome, or at least to dismiss him from his court. There is no evidence, however, that this order was carried out. At the request of the Byzantine Emperor Michael III, Eriugena undertook some translation into Latin of the works of Pseudo-Dionysius and added his own commentary. With this translation, he was the first since St. Augustine to introduce the ideas of Neoplatonism from the Greek into the Western European intellectual tradition, where they were to have a strong influence on Christian theology. Purification. Eriugena's great work, De Divisione Naturae, which was condemned by council at Sens by Honorius III, who described it as swarming with worms of heretical perversity, and by Gregory XIII in 1585, is arranged in 5 books. The form of exposition is that of dialogue. The method of reasoning is the syllogism. Nature is the name of the most comprehensive of all unities, that which contains within itself the most primary division of all things, that which is and that which is not. The Latin title refers to these 4 divisions of nature: that which creates and is not created, that which is created and creates, that which is created and does not create, that which is neither created nor creates. The first is God as the ground or origin of all things. The last is God as the final end, a goal of all things, that into which the world of created things ultimately returns. The second and third together compose the created universe, which is the manifestation of God, God in process. Theophania. The second is the world of Platonic ideas or forms, and the third is a more pantheistic world, or a pandeistic one, depending on the interference of God. Thus we distinguish in the divine system beginning middle and end, but these three are in essence one. The difference is only the consequence of our finite comprehension. We are compelled to envisage this eternal process under the form of time, to apply temporal distinctions to that which is extra or supratemporal. It is in turn through our experience that the incomprehensible divine is able to frame an understanding of itself. The division of nature has been called the final achievement of ancient philosophy, a work which synthesizes the philosophical accomplishments of 15 centuries. Quote, "It is presented, like Alcuin's book, as a dialogue between master and pupil." Eriugena anticipates Thomas Aquinas, who said that one cannot know and believe a thing at the same time. Eriugena explains that reason is necessarily to understand and interpret revelation. Authority is the source of knowledge, but the reason of mankind is the norm by which all authority is judged. Influence. Eriugena's work is distinguished by the freedom of his speculation, and the boldness with which he works out his logical or dialectical system of the universe. He marks, indeed, a stage of transition from the older Platonizing philosophy to the later scholasticism. For him, philosophy is not in the service of theology. The above-quoted assertion as to the substantial identity between philosophy and religion is repeated almost word for word by many of the later scholastic writers, but its significance depends upon the selection of one or other term of the identity as fundamental or primary. For Eriugena, philosophy or reason is first, primitive; authority or religion is secondary, derived. His influence was greater with mystics than with logicians, but he was responsible for a revival of philosophical thought which had remained largely dormant in Western Europe after the death of Boethius. After Eriugena, another medieval thinker of significance was Berengar of Tours, professor at the monastic school in the French city. Berengar believed that truth is obtained through reason rather than revelation. St. Peter Damian agreed with Tertullian that it is not necessarily for people to philosophize because God has spoken for them. Damian was prior of Fonte Avellana and afterward Cardinal Bishop of Ostia. He died in 1072. Lanfranc was prior of Bec in Normandy. Like Damian, he believed mostly in faith, but admitted the importance of reason. Saint Anselm was a pupil and successor of St. Peter Damian. On the whole, one might be surprised that even in the 17th century pantheism did not gain a complete victory over theism, for the most original, finest, and most thorough European expositions of it all came to light at that period, namely through Bruno, Malebranche, Spinoza, and Scotus Eriugena. After Scotus Eriugena had been lost and forgotten for many centuries, he was again discovered at Oxford in 1681. Thus, 4 years after Spinoza's death, his work first saw the light in print. This seems to prove that the insight of individuals cannot make itself felt so long as the spirit of the age is not ripe to receive it. On the other hand, in our day pantheism, although presented only in Schelling's eclectic and confused revival thereof, has become the dominant mode of thought of scholars and even of educated people. This is because Kant had preceded it with his overthrow of theistic dogmatism and had cleared the way for it, whereby the spirit of the age was ready for it, just as a plowed field is ready for the seed. Leszek Kolakowski, a Polish Marx scholar, has mentioned Eriugena as one of the primary influences on Hegel's, and therefore Marx's, dialectical form. In particular, he called the divisione naturae a prototype of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. Joke. William of Malmesbury's humorous anecdote illustrates both the character of Eriugena and the position he occupied at the French court. The king having asked, "Quid distat inter Sodom et Scotum?" Eriugena replied, "Tabula tantum." William of Malmesbury is not considered a reliable source on John Scotus Eriugena by modern scholars. For example, his reports that Eriugena is buried at Malmesbury is doubted by scholars who say that William confused John Eriugena with a different monk named John. William's report on the manner of Eriugena's death, killed by the pens of his students, also appears to be a legend. It seems certain that this is due to confusion with another John and that the manner of John's death is borrowed from the Acts of St. Cassian of Imola, feast the 28th of January. Translations: Johannes Scotus Eriugena, Purification, 3 vols, edited by I. P. Sheldon Williams. Purification, T.R.I.P. Sheldon Williams and J.J. O'Meara. The Voice of the Eagle. The Heart of Celtic Christianity. John Scotus Eriugena's homily on the prologue to the Gospel of St. John, translated and introduced by Christopher Bamford. I. Johannes Scotus Eriugena, Purification, edited by Edouard A. Jeannot, translated into English by John J. O'Meara and I. P. Sheldon Williams. Glossae Divinae Historiae, the Biblical Glosses of John Scotus Eriugena, edited by John J. Contrani and Padraig P. One Acute Dill. Treatise on Divine Predestination, translated by Mary Brennan. A 13th-century textbook of mystical theology at the University of Paris. The Mystical Theology of Dionysius the Areopagite, Eriugena's Latin translation, with the Scholia translated by Anastasius the librarian, and excerpts from Eriugena's Purification, translated and introduced by L. Michael Harrington, Dallas Medieval Texts and Translations, 4. Paul Roram, Eriugena's Commentary on the Dionysian Celestial Hierarchy.